Think about the last time you pulled out a dollar bill. You handed it over, grabbed your coffee, and walked away without giving it a second thought. That thin piece of green paper in your wallet feels completely natural, completely ordinary, as if it has been the permanent foundation of daily life since the dawn of time. But here is the startling truth. For the first 86 years of the United States as an independent republic, that green paper did not exist. There was no federally issued paper currency. Not a single government-printed dollar bill circulated through the veins of the economy. If you lived in America between the signing of the Declaration of Independence and the dark, desperate days of the Civil War, your pocket was filled with a bizarre, unpredictable, and often frustrating assortment of physical items, from foreign silver coins and paper slips issued by random local banks to dried leaves and seashells. How did an entire civilization, one destined to build the most formidable financial power in human history, function without the most basic tool of modern commerce? How did a farmer in the valleys of Virginia pay off his mortgage? How did a shopkeeper in Boston keep his business alive when no two customers were carrying the same kind of money? The answer is a wild, chaotic, and deeply human journey through systemic desperation, extreme improvisation, and one of the most remarkable stories of trust ever written. Because money, at its core, is not just math or metal. It is an emotional contract, a shared belief that a piece of physical matter possesses value simply because everyone agrees it does. And when a nation tries to build an economy from absolutely nothing, that contract is tested to its absolute limits. To truly understand how America survived without paper money, you have to travel back far beyond 1776, back to the early 1600s, when the first English settlers stepped off wooden ships onto the eastern coast of North America. They entered a dense, unfamiliar wilderness with no central banks, no mints, and no formal financial infrastructure whatsoever. Back in England, daily life revolved around hard currency, mostly silver pennies, shillings, and gold pounds. The settlers naturally assumed they could continue using the systems they knew, but they quickly ran into an immovable wall of imperial policy. The British Crown had zero interest in sending its precious gold and silver across the Atlantic to support a cluster of distant, struggling colonies. In fact, the Crown explicitly forbade the colonies from minting their own coins. This was not an oversight or a matter of administrative neglect. It was a cold, calculated exercise in power. In the 17th century, the right to mint currency was the ultimate symbol of royal sovereignty. To allow the colonies to manufacture their own money was to grant them a taste of financial independence, and Britain was determined to keep its settlements completely dependent on the mother country. Furthermore, under the reigning economic logic of mercantilism, colonies existed for one primary purpose: to enrich the homeland by sending raw materials back to England and buying British manufactured goods in return. This created an immediate, crippling structural problem for the colonists. Whatever small amounts of gold or silver coins they managed to bring across the sea were rapidly drained right back across the Atlantic to pay for imported tools, clothing, tea, and weapons. As Benjamin Franklin would later observe with characteristic clarity, hard money flowed into the colonies only to be instantly sucked back to London, leaving local businesses and tradespeople continuously starved of physical cash. The colonies found themselves trapped in a bizarre paradox. They were clearing land, building towns, raising crops, and conducting trade, yet they lacked the basic medium required to facilitate any of it efficiently. Left stranded without a functional currency, the colonists were forced to adapt. They turned first to the oldest economic mechanism known to humanity, pure barter. If you were a farmer with an abundance of corn and you needed a new pair of leather boots, you searched for a cobbler who happened to be running low on grain. If you were a carpenter who built a fence, you negotiated payment in milk, pork, or firewood. On paper, it sounds simple enough, a community coming together to share resources. In practice, it was an exhausting, agonizing way to live. Consider the sheer inefficiency of daily life under a barter system. Imagine you are a blacksmith working in Massachusetts in the year 1640. Your muscles ache, your hands are calloused, and your forge has been burning all day. You desperately need a sack of wheat flour to feed your family. You walk over to the local miller with a bundle of newly forged iron horseshoes. But the miller looks at your shoes, shakes his head, and tells you his horses are already fully shod. What he really needs is a new iron pot. Now, you cannot simply buy your flour. You have to embark on a tedious, multi-stage quest across town, carrying heavy iron horseshoes, trying to find a neighbor who needs horseshoes, owns a spare iron pot, and is willing to swap with you so you can finally take that pot to the miller for flour. In economic terms, barter suffers from what scholars call the double coincidence of wants. For a trade to occur, both parties must possess exactly what the other person desires at that precise moment. When that alignment fails, trade grinds to a halt. The barter system choked productivity, created endless personal friction, and placed a massive weight on the shoulders of anyone trying to build a business. People spent more time arranging complex, multi-party swaps than actually producing goods. It became painfully obvious that if the colonial economy was going to survive, it needed something better than pure barter. It needed commodity money, everyday physical items that held consistent value, were universally desired, and could act as a standing proxy for wealth. In the southern colonies, particularly in Virginia and Maryland, one crop quickly rose to absolute dominance, becoming not just the economic engine of the region, but its literal circulating cash, tobacco. In Virginia, tobacco was far more than an export commodity. It was official, legally recognized money. As early as 1619, a mere 12 years after the establishment of Jamestown, the Virginia House of Burgesses passed legislation designating tobacco as legal tender. You paid your local taxes in dried tobacco leaves. You settled your legal debts in tobacco. You paid your minister's salary in tobacco. You could even use tobacco to secure a spouse. When the Virginia Company arranged for young women to travel from England to the colony to establish families with the male settlers, the passage fee charged to the groom was fixed at 120 pounds of top-grade tobacco per bride. Tobacco possessed distinct physical traits that made it surprisingly suited for a primitive monetary system. It was grown everywhere across the region, making it widely available. It was highly prized in European markets, giving it inherent underlying value, and it was easily divisible. A buyer could settle a large transaction with heavy bales or pay for a tiny personal item with a few dried leaves weighed on a hand scale. Yet, relying on an agricultural crop as your primary national currency introduced mind-boggling risks. Tobacco was heavy, fragile, and prone to rotting if exposed to moisture. More critically, its supply was dictated by the unpredictable whims of nature. A season of perfect weather and abundant rainfall would produce a massive bumper crop, flooding the colony with millions of extra pounds of leaf. But in an economy where tobacco is money, a sudden surge in the tobacco supply does not make everyone richer. It triggers rapid, destructive inflation. Overnight, the purchasing power of every leaf in your barn plummeted because the market was drowning in excess supply. Conversely, a drought or a severe insect infestation would wipe out crops, causing sudden, violent deflations that left people unable to pay their basic debts. To bring some order to this volatile setup, Virginia eventually established a system of public tobacco warehouses. Farmers would bring their harvested tobacco to a government inspector, who checked its quality and weighed it. The farmer was then issued an official paper receipt stating that a specific quantity of high-grade tobacco was safely stored in the vault. These paper slips, known as tobacco warehouse receipts, began circulating from hand to hand as payment for goods and services. Instead of hauling hundreds of pounds of smelly, brittle leaves to the general store, a merchant could simply hand over a piece of paper representing those leaves. This was a brilliant, highly sophisticated workaround. Without realizing it, these early Southern planters were conducting one of North America's earliest experiments with asset-backed paper money. They were learning a foundational psychological lesson. People did not actually want to carry physical commodities. They wanted a trusted, lightweight symbol that represented real value stored somewhere safe. While Southern planters were trading receipts for dried leaves, a completely different form of money was taking root in the North, one borrowed from the indigenous nations who had inhabited the continent for thousands of years, wampum. For centuries, popular history has mischaracterized wampum as simple Indian money, reduced to a crude form of primitive cash. That framing entirely erases its deep spiritual and cultural significance. Among eastern woodland nations, including the Haudenosaunee and the Munsee, wampum consisted of intricately crafted cylindrical beads carved laboriously from the shells of whelks and quahog clams. To native peoples, wampum was sacred. It was used to record historical treaties, bind diplomatic alliances, commemorate tribal elders, and mark solemn spiritual ceremonies. It was an embodiment of memory, trust, and sacred obligation, far removed from the cold mechanics of commercial buy and sell transactions. However, when Dutch and English traders arrived in the early 1620s, they observed the profound value indigenous communities placed on these shell beads. The colonists quickly realized that if they could acquire large quantities of wampum, they could use it as a bridge currency to purchase valuable beaver pelts, land, and timber from native hunters. By 1643, the Massachusetts Bay Colony had officially declared wampum legal tender for small transactions among colonists as well. Authorities established precise exchange rates. Polished white beads, carved from whelk shells, carried a specific monetary value, while the rarer dark purple beads, carved from the deep violet section of the quahog shell, were worth double. For nearly 2 decades, wampum helped keep the northern colonial economy moving, functioning as the primary small change currency in town markets and coastal trading posts. Yet, like tobacco, wampum suffered from fatal vulnerabilities when forced into a European-style commercial system. European settlers, armed with steel drill bits and mechanical lathes, began mass-producing shell beads at speeds indigenous artisans had never imagined. This sudden, artificial surge in production flooded the market with low-quality, mass-manufactured beads, triggering severe monetary depreciation. Furthermore, dishonest traders began dyeing white beads purple or producing counterfeit beads out of cheap stone and bone. By 1660, colonial governments stripped wampum of its legal tender status, though it continued to circulate informally along the remote western frontiers for generations. As native shell beads faded and commodity crops proved far too clumsy for large-scale international business, another currency emerged to fill the vacuum, one that would dominate American commerce for more than 2 centuries. It was not English, it was not American, and it was not printed on paper. It was the Spanish milled dollar, minted from vast silver deposits extracted from the mines of Potosi and Zacatecas in the Spanish colonies of South America and Mexico. The Spanish silver dollar, known formally as the Real de Ocho, or the Piece of 8, was arguably the most respected, reliable coin on the planet during the 17th and 18th centuries. Because the Spanish Empire maintained a vast global trading network spanning from South America to Europe and across the Pacific to Asia, its silver dollar became a universal medium of exchange. It was heavy, beautifully struck, and remarkably consistent in its silver purity. For American merchants in coastal cities like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston, the Spanish dollar was a financial godsend. It provided a stable, universally recognized standard of value that anyone, anywhere, would willingly accept. The influence of the Spanish dollar on early American life was so pervasive that it permanently reshaped how Americans spoke, calculated value, and structured their institutions. Because physical silver coins were constantly in short supply, colonists frequently had to adapt a single large silver coin to pay for tiny, everyday items like a loaf of bread or a mug of ale. Their solution was wonderfully literal. They took a heavy iron chisel and a hammer, placed the Spanish silver dollar on an anvil, and physically chopped the coin into 8 wedge-shaped pie pieces. Each individual piece was worth 1 real or 1 bit. If an item cost $0.25, you paid with 2 of those silver wedges. That simple physical practice of cutting up silver money gave birth to the classic American slang phrase, 2 bits to represent 25 cents. The Spanish dollar was so deeply woven into the daily habits of the American people that when the Founding Fathers finally established a national monetary system after independence, they did not base the nation's brand new currency on the British pound sterling. They looked directly to the silver coin from Spain. The Coinage Act of 1792 explicitly mandated that the new United States dollar would be modeled directly after the physical weight and purity of the Spanish milled dollar. In fact, the Spanish dollar remained legally recognized currency inside the United States all the way until 1857, nearly 70 years after the ratification of the Constitution. For generations of Americans, the standard money in their pockets was not a picture of an American president or a federal seal. It was a foreign silver coin stamped with the coat of arms of the Spanish king. Yet, even with Spanish silver, dried tobacco leaves, and shell beads circulating across the towns and farms, the fundamental problem remained unsolved. Physical commodities were too volatile, and silver coins were far too scarce to support a rapidly expanding population that dreamed of building a continent-spanning power. The colonies were growing, trade was expanding, and the thirst for a flexible, reliable, and lightweight medium of exchange was reaching a boiling point. The invisible economy of improvisations, barter, and hacked-up silver could only carry them so far. Sooner or later, someone was going to have to make a radical, dangerous leap into the unknown. Someone was going to have to take a piece of plain paper, write a number on it, and convince an entire society that it was worth its weight in gold. By 1690, the pressure on the colonial economy had reached a critical breaking point. The clumsy patchwork of tobacco leaves, shell beads, and scarce foreign silver was no longer enough to keep up with the demands of an expanding society. That was the year the Massachusetts Bay Colony took a desperate, unprecedented leap into the financial unknown. One that would forever alter the trajectory of North American commerce. Massachusetts had just launched a disastrous, poorly managed military expedition against French forces in Quebec during King William's War. When the surviving colonial soldiers returned home to Boston, cold, exhausted, and bitter, they demanded their immediate pay. But the colonial treasury was entirely empty. There was no gold, no silver, and no way to collect enough hard coin through taxes quickly enough to satisfy hundreds of angry, armed men on the verge of mutiny. Facing total social collapse, the government of Massachusetts did something no Western government had ever attempted. They fired up a printing press and issued paper bills of credit. These bills were not backed by gold or silver sitting in a vault. They were essentially government I owe us, printed slips of paper carrying an official promise that the colony would accept them as valid payment for all future taxes. Initially, the soldiers and local merchants were deeply skeptical, treating the paper slips with extreme caution. But because everyone knew they could use these notes to satisfy their annual tax obligations to the state, the bills held a baseline of real-world utility. People began accepting them for food, supplies, and rent. By 1692, Massachusetts officially designated these paper bills as legal tender. Against all historical expectations, the radical experiment worked. Watching from the sidelines, neighboring colonies realized they had just witnessed a financial miracle. One by one, virtually every British colony in North America began printing its own paper money throughout the early 1700s. By the onset of the American Revolution, 14 different colonial jurisdictions had issued their own unique paper currencies. But this rapid expansion brought a nightmare of total financial fragmentation. Every single colony printed notes in its own local denominations, with its own artistic designs, its own fluctuating exchange rates, and its own level of institutional honesty. A Rhode Island pound was not worth the same as a Pennsylvania pound, which was radically different from a South Carolina pound. A merchant in Philadelphia, receiving paper bills from a trader in neighboring New Jersey, had to pause, open a ledger, and calculate a steep discount to protect himself against the risk that the New Jersey Treasury might fail. Furthermore, the temptation to print money proved irresistible to politicians. When local assemblies ran low on funds, they simply printed more notes, completely ignoring the basic laws of supply and demand. Colonies like Rhode Island overissued paper currency so recklessly that the value of their notes cratered, wiping out the life savings of ordinary citizens overnight and creating furious trade disputes across colonial borders. In London, the British Parliament watched this monetary chaos across the ocean with growing anger and alarm. To the Crown, the colonies were losing control of their economic systems, undermining British merchants who were being paid in worthless, depreciated paper. In response, Parliament passed the Currency Acts of 1751 and 1764, outright banning the American colonies from issuing new paper bills of credit or declaring paper money as legal tender for private debts. The colonists were incandescent with rage. To them, the ability to issue their own paper money was the single lifeline keeping their local businesses alive in the absence of imperial silver. While history textbooks endlessly focus on the Stamp Act and the tax on tea, these currency bans were a far deeper, more existential grievance that convinced many colonial leaders that British rule was actively suffocating American economic survival. When full-scale war finally erupted in 1775, the newly formed Continental Congress faced an immediate, terrifying dilemma. Firing rifles requires gunpowder, soldiers require food and boots, and armies require massive financial capital. But the Continental Congress had no authority to levy taxes, no credit history to borrow from European banks, and virtually zero reserves of gold or silver. Desperate to keep Washington's army in the field, Congress turned to the only weapon they had left. They started the printing presses. In June of 1775, Congress authorized the creation of a national paper currency known as the Continental dollar. Each bill carried an explicit pledge that the bearer would eventually be paid in real Spanish-milled dollars, funded by future tax revenues collected by the individual states. But the execution was a complete structural catastrophe. The 13 newly formed states routinely ignored Congress's requests to collect taxes to retire the notes. Simultaneously, individual states continued printing their own separate war currencies, drowning the infant economy in a sea of unbacked paper. To make matters vastly worse, the British military set up massive counterfeiting operations, printing millions of fake Continental dollars and deliberately flooding them into American towns to destroy public trust in the revolutionary government. The result was hyperinflation on a scale never before seen in North America. Congress kept printing money to buy supplies, and as the supply of paper exploded, its purchasing power vanished into thin air. In 1775, one Continental dollar traded at equal value to one silver dollar. By 1779, it took 40 Continental dollars to buy a single silver coin. By 1781, the ratio collapsed to a staggering 1,000 to 1. Prices for everyday food and clothing skyrocketed out of reach. A pair of basic leather shoes that cost $2 before the war suddenly cost several hundred paper dollars. A single wagon load of paper money could barely buy a single wagon load of grain for starving soldiers at Valley Forge. Across the country, the currency became a national laughingstock. A barber in Philadelphia famously pasted worthless Continental notes all over the walls of his shop as cheap wallpaper. A mob in another city tarred a stray dog, covered it from head to tail in paper Continental bills, and paraded it through the streets in mock protest. The phrase, "not worth a Continental," burned itself into the American lexicon as a permanent synonym for absolute, irredeemable worthlessness. When Congress was finally forced to officially admit defeat and write off the currency, millions of ordinary citizens, farmers who had sold their harvests to the army, shopkeepers who had accepted the notes out of patriotic duty, and veterans who had bled for independence, were left holding stacks of meaningless paper. They had sacrificed everything for the revolution, only to be financially ruined by its money. This hyperinflationary trauma left a deep, painful scar on the collective psyche of the nation's leaders. When the Constitutional Convention assembled in Philadelphia in 1787 to draft a new blueprint for the United States, the delegates were haunted by the ghost of the ruined Continental dollar. They had seen firsthand how unbacked paper money could destroy trust, tear communities apart, and bring an emerging nation to its knees. They resolved to hammer a permanent stake through the heart of paper money. The result was Article 1, Section 10 of the United States Constitution, which explicitly stripped individual states of the power to coin money, issue bills of credit, or make anything other than gold and silver coin a legal tender for the payment of debts. When it came to the federal government, the framers gave Congress the power to coin money and regulate its value, but conspicuously omitted any mention of printing paper currency. This silence was entirely intentional. Men like George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison believed that a healthy republic must anchor its economy strictly to hard metal, gold and silver possessing real intrinsic physical value, rather than the dangerous, fleeting promises of paper-printing politicians. In 1792, Congress passed the Seminole Coinage Act, establishing the United States Mint in Philadelphia and anchoring the new nation to a bimetallic standard of gold and silver. The act created beautiful new national coins, the gold eagle, the silver dollar, and the copper cent. Alexander Hamilton, serving as the first Secretary of the Treasury, designed the system to establish instant credibility on the global financial stage. To ensure absolute integrity, the law included a terrifying penalty. Any officer or employee of the United States Mint caught debasing or shaving the precious metal content of the nation's coins could be sentenced to death. That was how fiercely the founding generation guarded the sanctity of hard cash. There was only one fatal flaw with Hamilton's hard money dream. The United States did not possess enough physical gold and silver to support its explosive growth. As the 1800s dawned, millions of settlers surged west, clearing wilderness, founding cities, and building factories. The demand for commercial credit and circulating medium skyrocketed, but the U.S. Mint struggled endlessly to acquire enough raw bullion to stamp out sufficient coins. Gold and silver coins kept vanishing from circulation, hoarded by nervous citizens or exported to Europe and the Caribbean to pay for foreign imports. The country was caught in a crippling structural vice. The Constitution mandated hard money, but the physical supply of hard money was nowhere to be found. Into this massive vacuum stepped private banks, triggering the wild, chaotic era of free banking. Since states could not print paper money directly, they granted charter licenses to private state-level banks, allowing them to issue their own paper banknotes. These banknotes were not official government currency. They were private IOUs, promising that the bank would redeem the paper note for actual gold or silver coins upon demand at its front counter. In theory, it sounded manageable. In practice, it plunged the nation into decades of monetary anarchy. By the 1830s, hundreds of state-chartered banks were operating across the country, each printing its own distinct paper money in every imaginable color, shape, and denomination. Soon, there were over 8,000 different varieties of private banknotes circulating throughout the United States. Merchants in major trade hubs were overwhelmed. A banknote issued by a reputable bank in New York might be accepted at full face value in Manhattan, but if you carried that same bill west to Ohio, local merchants would demand a steep 15 or 20% discount just to take it off your hands, factoring in the difficulty of traveling all the way back to New York to collect the physical gold. To navigate this bewildering maze, merchants had to keep a pocket-sized manual known as a banknote reporter sitting continuously on their counters. These thick, frequently updated guides listed thousands of active banks alongside their current discount rates and detailed descriptions of known counterfeit notes. Daily transactions felt like an interrogation. Every time a customer handed over a paper bill, the shopkeeper had to stop, flip through his guide, inspect the paper, calculate the regional discount, and judge whether the issuing bank was still solvent. This utter lack of central oversight opened the floodgates to mass criminal fraud and the rise of the notorious Wildcat banks. These were fraudulent or deeply undercapitalized financial operations set up in remote, inaccessible locations, supposedly where only wildcats lived, specifically so that note holders could never physically find the office to demand their gold. Bank examiners dispatched by state governments reported jaw-dropping scams. Frontier bankers would fill wooden kegs with rusted nails and scrap iron, cover the top with a thin layer of genuine gold coins, and present it to inspectors as proof of solvency. As soon as the inspector left, that single barrel of gold would be loaded onto a horse-drawn wagon, rushed through the night to the next frontier bank, and presented to the same inspector the following morning. These Wildcat institutions printed stacks of impressive ornate banknotes, pushed them out into surrounding towns to buy real goods, and then vanished into thin air overnight. When a bank suddenly went bust, every farmer, laborer, and shopkeeper holding its paper bills was left with worthless trash. By the 1850s, an estimated 1/3 of all paper money circulating in the United States was completely counterfeit, fake, or issued by banks that had already failed. This chaotic free-for-all reached its absolute peak after President Andrew Jackson waged his furious war against the Second Bank of the United States. Jackson, a fierce frontiersman who deeply mistrusted paper money and central financial elites, vetoed the bank's charter in 1832 and dismantled the nation's only stabilizing central financial institution. Jackson believed he was liberating the common man from a corrupt financial monopoly, but his destruction of the central bank removed the last remaining guardrail holding back the torrent of private paper money. For nearly 3 decades, from 1837 to 1861, America functioned as the Wild West of global finance. It was an economy built on extreme paranoia, where money was not a universal constant, but a risky gamble. Every transaction was an exercise in suspicion, every bill in your pocket a potential fraud, and every bank a potential trap. The nation had built an astonishing physical empire of farms, canals, railroads, and factories, but its financial circulatory system was completely broken, fractured into thousands of unreliable pieces. It was a chaotic, fragile system, hanging by a thread, and it was about to be smashed to pieces by the most devastating war in American history. In the spring of 1861, the fragile, fractured experiment of American finance came crashing down against the reality of total war. When the Civil War erupted, it was not merely a profound political and military crisis. It was an unprecedented fiscal earthquake. Armed conflict on a modern industrial scale demanded astronomical sums of capital. The federal government, which had historically operated on a modest annual budget funded primarily by land sales and foreign tariffs, suddenly needed to raise millions of dollars every single day to recruit, clothe, feed, arm, and transport massive armies across thousands of miles of battlefield. The old financial mechanisms immediately collapsed under the weight of this terrifying demand. The government tried to secure short-term gold loans from private northern banks, but as the bloody reality of the war set in, nervous citizens began hoarding their physical gold and silver coins under floorboards and inside mattresses. Hard metal vanished from circulation almost overnight. By December of 1861, private banks across the nation suspended gold redemptions entirely, quickly followed by the United States Treasury itself. The nation was bankrupt, its armies were in the field awaiting pay, and the Union was on the brink of complete financial collapse. Faced with the literal destruction of the United States, Congress realized that ideological debates about hard money and gold standards were luxuries the nation could no longer afford. On February 25, 1862, Congress passed a monumental, revolutionary piece of legislation that permanently altered the modern world, the Legal Tender Act. For the very first time in American history, the federal government bypassed gold, silver, and private bank promises, using its sovereign authority to print paper currency directly. These new bills were officially designated as United States notes, but because their reverse sides were printed in bright green ink, the public immediately gave them a nickname that would resonate down through history: Greenbacks. Unlike the private banknotes of the past, greenbacks were not backed by gold or silver sitting in a secure vault. They were backed by nothing tangible whatsoever. Each note carried a simple, uncompromising legal mandate. This note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. That was the entire legal foundation. No guarantee that you could swap it for a gold coin, no promise of silver redemption, just a federal decree stating that these pieces of paper were official money and that every citizen within the nation was legally required to accept them. The initial authorization called for $150 million in greenbacks, but as the war dragged on and expenses skyrocketed, Congress authorized additional waves of paper money. By the time the war finally came to a close in 1865, nearly $450 million in greenbacks had been pumped into the economy. Distrust was swift and severe. In California and Oregon, where gold was plentiful and cultural suspicion of paper ran deep, merchants initially defied the Legal Tender Act, refusing to take greenbacks at face value. Millions of Americans looked at the new green bills with profound anxiety, remembering the devastating collapse of the Continental dollar during the Revolution. Those fears were not entirely unfounded. As the sheer volume of greenbacks expanded, their purchasing power relative to physical gold began to drop sharply. By the summer of 1864, during the darkest and bloodiest phases of the war, a paper greenback dollar traded at a value equivalent to just 35 cents in gold coin. Inflation surged across northern cities, driving up the cost of basic food, fuel, and clothing. Leaving working families struggling to keep pace, soldiers fighting on the front lines were paid in paper currency that lost purchasing power with every passing month. Yet, against all historical odds, the greenback did not collapse. Unlike the fragile Continental Congress of 1775, the Union government of 1862 possessed the central authority, institutional infrastructure, and raw political power to back up its currency. The federal government implemented sweeping new national income taxes, internal excise taxes, and high tariffs, creating direct demand for its own paper money. People needed greenbacks because they needed to pay their federal taxes. Simultaneously, Congress took decisive action to eliminate the chaotic patchwork of private banknotes that had plagued the country for decades. Through the National Banking Acts of 1863 and 1864, the government established a system of federally chartered national banks authorized to issue uniform banknotes backed directly by federal government bonds. To ensure state banks could no longer flood the country with competing private currencies, Congress slapped a crippling 10% tax on state banknotes in 1866. It was an intentional death blow. State banknotes vanished from circulation virtually overnight, leaving the nation with a single, uniform, federally supervised paper money supply for the very first time in its history. When the war finally ended and the Union was preserved, the United States found itself standing in a completely altered financial universe. The debate over paper money continued to rage violently across political rallies and congressional halls for decades, culminating in intense battles over the gold standard and the rise of the populist movement. But the fundamental transformation that occurred in 1862 was absolute and permanent. The existential panic of the Civil War had forced the American people to cross a profound psychological threshold. They had learned that money did not need to be a heavy lump of yellow metal dug out of the earth. It could be a simple symbol, a light piece of paper whose power was sustained entirely by collective institutional trust, shared economic activity, and sovereign authority. When you zoom out and trace this extraordinary two-century arc, from colonial settlers counting out bundles of smelly tobacco leaves in Virginia, to Dutch traders stringing clamshell beads in New York, to frontier merchants chopping up heavy Spanish silver dollars with chisels, to shopkeepers desperately scanning banknote reporters to spot counterfeit bills, you begin to see the modern dollar in a completely new light. The physical piece of paper sitting in your wallet right now is not an ancient, unchanging reality. It is the direct descendant of those emergency Civil War greenbacks printed in 1862 to save a dying republic. It is a monument to a centuries-long journey of trial, failure, disaster, and resilience. Since 1971, when the last remaining link between the US dollar and physical gold was formally cut, every dollar bill in circulation operates on the exact same mechanism that kept the Union alive during the darkest hours of the Civil War: pure, unadulterated trust. Trust that the store owner will accept it for food, trust that your employer will accept it for your labor, and trust that the government behind it will remain stable enough to enforce its value. The next time you pull out a green bill to pay for your morning coffee, take a brief moment to look at it closely. You're not just holding a medium of exchange, you're holding a physical record of America's longest, wildest experiment, a piece of paper that only works because an entire nation collectively decides to believe in the promise written across its face.